In August 2024, thick black smoke rose above the Minsk in a lagoon near the Yangtze River at Nantong, China. Flames reached the superstructure. The island partly collapsed. Fire crews fought through almost 24 hours before the blaze ended. The carrier had not been in service for more than 3 decades. It sat in a man-made lagoon, rusting through another conversion. A theme park had planned to open around the ship since 2014. It never opened. Renovation work sparked the latest attempt to give the former Soviet warship a new purpose. Instead, the Minsk remained inside a Chinese industrial park, damaged and abandoned. The wreck in Nantong points back to a mission far removed from an American floating airbase. Minsk began with a Soviet command decision: protect missile submarines before they reached patrol areas. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov faced a different naval problem. The United States Navy placed each carrier at the center of a strike group. Its aircraft could strike distant targets wherever the American president ordered action. Escorts guarded the carrier. Supply ships kept it moving. The whole group protected its central ship. Soviet ballistic missile submarines left bases in the Barents Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Their propellers carried them toward patrol grounds under the threat of NATO anti-submarine forces. That transit mattered. A submarine had to reach open water before enemy hunters found it. Minsk carried aircraft for the route above those boats. Surface ships watched the air while the submarines moved below. The carrier group extended air cover across the ocean corridors through which missile submarines reached patrol duty. That ocean mission required a ship Moscow could actually send beyond the Black Sea. Project 1143, Krechet, became the Kiev-class. Official papers called it a heavy aircraft-carrying cruiser. The name mattered. Workers built these ships at the Black Sea shipyard in Mykolaiv. From there, every hull faced the same route: out of the Black Sea, through the Bosphorus, then through the Dardanelles toward open water. The passage was narrow. There was no alternate sea route. The Montreux Convention of 1936 governed those Turkish straits and prohibited aircraft carriers from passing through them in either direction. Moscow described the Kiev-class as cruisers under international law and used that classification to argue for transit. The restriction remained written in the convention. Aircraft carriers could not pass the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. Beyond the straits, the cruiser showed its real layout. 12 angled SS-12 sandbox launchers filled the bow, aimed at enemy ships. Metal covers sealed the missiles. SA-3 and SA-4 air defense launchers stood nearby, with twin 76mm guns. Anti-submarine rocket launchers and torpedo tubes completed the forward battery. Behind that weapons deck, the flight deck shifted to port across the stern. Rotor noise replaced the launcher's steel lids. It could handle vertical takeoff aircraft and helicopters, but conventional carrier jets had no place there. The bow carried missiles, guns, rockets, and torpedoes. The stern carried the limited air group. One hull, 2 combat tasks. The rear deck accepted only vertical takeoff aircraft and helicopters. The ship's aviation arm had a narrow reach. In vertical mode, the Yak-38 Forger could strike only about 185 to 195 kilometers away. That was roughly 1/4 of the Harrier's radius. The engines roared. The Yak-38 took off and landed vertically by redirecting engine thrust. Vertical flight left little room for weapons, and the aircraft carried a limited combat load. No look-down radar. Low-flying aircraft could stay below it, beyond the Yak-38's detection. At dangerous low-altitude attitudes, an automatic ejection seat fired without the pilot's command. More than 50 Yak-38 aircraft were lost in accidents during its service life. Those aircraft losses belonged to a ship built before the class reached its final form. 4 Kiev-class carriers followed in sequence. Kiev entered service in 1975. Minsk came second in 1978. Novorossiysk followed in 1982. Baku entered service in 1987. Baku later became Admiral 87. Baku later became Admiral Gorshkov. It carried a phased array radar and upgraded weapons. Minsk had arrived before those changes. Workers laid Minsk down on December 28, 1972, at the Chernomorsky shipyard in Mykolaiv. That missile decision shaped the next stage. Minsk entered the water on September 30, 1975, then spent years in sea trials and flight deck work before joining the Soviet fleet on September 27, 1978. The hull measured 273 meters. Fully loaded, it displaced 41,380 tons. 4 steam turbines delivered 140,000 shaft horsepower and pushed the cruiser to about 59 kilometers per hour. Its air wing defined the assignment. 12 Yak-38 aircraft handled limited strikes. 16 Ka-25 helicopters hunted submarines. Missile armament remained aboard. The aircraft and helicopters set Minsk's daily tasks. The new order sent Minsk to Vladivostok. From February to July 1979, she covered roughly 20,000 kilometers from the Black Sea to the Pacific. The Suez Canal barred Soviet warships. Minsk went around Africa instead. Destroyers and tankers followed her across the ocean, with calls at Luanda, Maputo, Port Louis, and Aden. USS Elliott shadowed the passage. Both navies watched each other at sea. When Minsk reached Vladivostok, she took her place in the Pacific Fleet. From Vladivostok, Minsk headed for Cam Ranh after the 1979 war. China had briefly invaded Vietnam. Vietnam stood with Moscow. The South China Sea raised the pressure. The United States 7th Fleet was the main opponent. Its carrier groups operated from Japan. Minsk carried aircraft and helicopters on deck. In September 1980, the cruiser entered Cam Ranh. The visit placed a Pacific Fleet carrier cruiser beside a Soviet ally. No combat order appeared, but the message was clear. The Soviet Union backed Vietnam, and Minsk showed it. That display of support soon faced a harder test. During her second deployment in 1982, Minsk returned to Vietnam, then sailed into the Indian Ocean. The stakes changed at sea. In December 1982, 2 armed Yak-38 aircraft roared from Minsk's deck over the Arabian Sea. Their target was aircraft from the American carrier USS Enterprise. They carried missiles. It was the first time Soviet vertical takeoff aircraft armed with missiles intercepted American aircraft. The flight proved Minsk could launch its aircraft in contested airspace. Yet the interception settled nothing about the Yak-38 itself. Against the aircraft it met, its combat effectiveness remained in doubt. Those doubts followed Minsk into Wonsan in July 1986. One of the few Soviet carrier visits to North Korean waters put the whole air wing on display. Western intelligence photographed the flight deck from above. Yak-38s stood beside Ka-25 helicopters. The deck was full. The image recorded more than presence. Since 1985, Minsk had sent Yak-38s off with a short takeoff, not a vertical launch. The short run increased payload and range. It also gave up the pure vertical departure that had defined the aircraft. Engines roared across the deck. Ka-25s were also leaving the ship. The fleet replaced them step by step with Ka-27s, carrying better sensors and heavier torpedo armament. Those helicopters improved the anti-submarine wing. They did not change the carrier's central problem. Soviet designers were already developing the supersonic Yak-141 as a replacement. Yak-38 remained aboard, but its vertical launch yielded to a short run for payload and range. That longer takeoff run bought the Yak-38 time, but not a replacement. Throughout the 1980s, Soviet designers developed the supersonic Yak-141. One prototype completed successful supersonic flights. Tests then moved aboard Admiral Gorshkov. During carrier trials, a crash landing nearly killed the pilot. Damage marked the deck. Flight success could not erase that failure at sea. By the late 1980s, Soviet finances were deteriorating. 4 large aviation cruisers needed constant maintenance and a specialized air wing nearing obsolescence. The expense became harder to justify. The Kiev-class never received its intended aircraft. After the crash landing and financial decline, officials ended the Yak-141 program in 1991. With no replacement aircraft left, Minsk's next failure ended her service altogether. A mechanical accident stopped the ship and sent her back toward the yard that had built her in Mykolaiv. Its exact cause remains concealed. Soviet and Russian naval records still keep the details classified. The damage required the facilities of the Chernomorsky shipyard. By then, Mykolaiv stood in newly independent Ukraine, no longer inside the Soviet Union. The Russian Navy faced a collapsing economy and rejected the repair cost. The ship remained damaged. The public record offers no list of broken parts or official account of the accident. Those details remain closed in Soviet and Russian naval files. With repair money refused, the decision came quickly. On June 30, 1993, Minsk left the fleet after 15 years in service. Kiev left that same day. It had sat in reserve since 1991. Novorossiysk also disappeared from the rolls that year. Admiral Gorshkov held on until 1996. The 4 Kiev-class carriers were leaving service in rapid succession. In 1995, a South Korean businessman bought Minsk and Novorossiysk. Both hulls went under tow to South Korea. Workers broke up Novorossiysk at Pohang. Minsk waited beside the port for the same outcome. Environmental groups objected to the carrier's presence. They cited hazardous materials in its construction. The dismantling stopped before Minsk was cut apart. A company from Guangdong then bought the ship, publicly for scrapping. But ownership changed again. CK Investment took Minsk. Its plans did not include dismantling the carrier. Chinese buyers presented Minsk as a future theme park. Western and Taiwanese analysts saw another possible value: access to a carrier's internal arrangement. China had also bought Kiev for a similar tourist project while developing its own carrier capability. Analysts suggested engineers could inspect flight deck layouts, aircraft elevators, arresting wires, and island superstructures before conversion began. That remained a theory. Beijing denied any military purpose. Both ships were commercial attractions, officials said. Open sources still cannot confirm that Minsk or Kiev contributed to China's carrier program. The timeline was real. China bought the unfinished Varyag hull from Ukraine in 1998, then rebuilt it as Liaoning. In 2012, China commissioned Liaoning, its first operational aircraft carrier. Roughly 15 years separated the purchases from that result. Before that carrier entered service, Minsk had already become a tourist site in Shenzhen. On May 10, 2000, Minsk World opened in Shatujiao, beside Dapeng Bay. The ship sat at a purpose-built berth. Its weapons were gone. Crews rebuilt the interior for visitors. 4 decks opened to the public, including the flight deck and hangar deck. Former living quarters became exhibits. Replica weapons filled former armament positions. Guides in mock uniforms led groups through the ship. Retired Soviet and Chinese aircraft stood across the flight deck. MiG-23 fighters, Mi-24 helicopters. Visitors also took motorboat rides along Minsk's starboard side. The stripped ship gave the park its main attraction. By 2005, Minsk World had drawn more than 5 million visitors. Revenue reached 450 million yuan. The crowds did not erase the debt. Operators had borrowed 800 million yuan to develop the park and surrounding land. Management then lent park funds to other companies. Many collapsed. Their loans never returned. China Construction Bank and 7 other banks had extended credit to Minsk World's operators. When payments stopped, they filed suit. In 2006, the Shenzhen Intermediate People's Court declared the park bankrupt and ordered the park and carrier transferred to creditors. On May 31, 2006, an auction in Shenzhen sold Minsk for 128 million yuan to CITIC Shenzhen, a state-owned holding company. New managers renamed the site CITIC Minsk World. The carrier remained open for another decade. On February 14, 2016, the park closed. That closure exposed a split between 2 sister ships. Kiev and Minsk reached China as visitor attractions. Kiev arrived first, sold in 1996. The Minsk deal closed 2 years later. China turned both hulls into military theme parks. Kiev opened in Tianjin in 2004. Both carriers came from the same shipyard, entered service within 3 years, and left service on the same day. They stood roughly 100 kilometers apart. The contrast was stark. Kiev drew steady crowds, managed its finances, and kept its gates open. Minsk World lost money almost from the start. Its operators borrowed to cover losses, then loaned money to other companies. In 2006, Minsk World declared bankruptcy. Kiev's part kept receiving visitors. Minsk World already depended on loans to cover its losses. By February 2016, debt had closed Minsk World. The carrier left under tow for repairs in Jushan, then moved again. Its next berth was a man-made lagoon in Nantong, Jiangsu, beside the Sutong Bridge over the Yangtze. Developers announced a new carrier tourism resort. They put Minsk at its center and promised a national defense education attraction. The resort was due to open in 2022. Work was meant to begin in 2021. Nothing began. Minsk remained fixed in the lagoon, with no repair work underway. 2 ownership changes and decades without maintenance had left the ship worse off. Urban explorers climbed aboard and uploaded recordings online. Their footage showed rusted passageways, stripped rooms, and decay across the ship. Renovation crews had returned to Minsk. On August 16, 2024, fire broke out aboard the carrier at about 4 in the afternoon local time. Thick smoke rose over the ship. Flames spread across the island during the work. The fire burned for nearly 24 hours before crews extinguished it. No deaths or injuries were reported. Investigators examined the cause. When the smoke cleared, photographs showed the damage. Part of the island and command tower had collapsed. The superstructure was gutted. Below the main deck, large sections of the hull carried burned metal. That fire left Minsk awaiting another decision. The 4 Soviet-built Kiev-class ships had already taken different routes. One remains India's flagship. One became a park attraction. One went to scrap. Kiev went to China in 1996. It now stands at the Binhai Aircraft Carrier Theme Park in Tianjin. Novorossiysk reached South Korea, where workers dismantled it. Admiral Gorshkov went to India in 2004. Russia rebuilt Admiral Gorshkov at great cost. India commissioned it in 2013 as INS Vikramaditya. It remains the Indian Navy's flagship. The 4 hulls no longer share a single fate. Minsk had served with the Pacific Fleet. Soviet planners built it to protect nuclear submarines in the Pacific. It deployed to Vietnam, India, Korea, and the Arabian Sea. Then the Soviet Union dissolved. The fleet decommissioned Minsk when it was 15 years old. Chinese entrepreneurs kept it from the scrapyard and turned it into a theme park. The park went bankrupt. An auction sent the ship to a lagoon on the Yangtze. Renovation work began for another park. That park never opened. Fire then tore through the ship during those repairs. Minsk still stands in the Yangtze Lagoon after the fire of 2024.